film captured during World War II street fighting in 1944 was viewed at Warsaw's Palladium. All the while, Poland's capital was suffering heavy casualties. Hi, I'm Matt, and welcome to this edition of Borders on Budgets. On this episode, we are at the Warsaw Uprising Museum, where Poland's combative spirit against all odds is on display.
The information was extracted from them.
Barbed wire in the electrified fence. 136 people died. The poignancy of war. Mortality was 10%. Warsaw's sewer system served as a valuable tool for the movement of insurgents and for the purposes of communication. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1st, 1944, after the Polish underground had been united for 2 years and with the assistance of the Polish government in exile in London. And the purpose of the uprising was to liberate Poland from then the German occupation and before the Soviets, who were to the east of the city, were able to capture Poland's capital on the counteroffensive.
And what Polish people wanted to do was to start the fights here in Warsaw against the Germans just a few days before the Soviets were supposed to enter. Polish people were supposed to fight for a few days. They were supposed to retake from the Germans as much Warsaw as possible. And then the Soviet army was supposed to enter. They were supposed to help us liberate Warsaw from the Germans. Then we, from the position of hosts, would be able to talk to the Soviets about our future in Warsaw, the capital city of Poland. Well, it has to be said, unfortunately, that Warsaw Uprising did not have a very important effect. Basically, we've lost. Our goal was to liberate ourselves with the help of the Soviets. The Soviets didn't help us. We're fighting, we have to say this, a hopeless fight for 63 days. Ultimately, the city was destroyed, a lot of people were killed. And basically the Soviets entered Warsaw some months afterwards.
A year before the uprising, unbeknownst to many, leaders of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union were already deciding the fates of post-war Europe. Particularly for the Soviet Union and its leader Joseph Stalin, that country already had eyes on Central Europe, particularly Poland. That's why during the uprising, the Soviets offered very little assistance to the Polish insurgents, as Michael explains.
Basically, the Soviets they didn't have a lot to gain by assisting us. They could wait. It didn't affect their plans. And while they were waiting, the Germans and the Poles were fighting Warsaw. So, from the perspective of the Soviets, basically their enemies were killing each other. Well, after the uprising, Warsaw was called the City of Graves. It would be Miasto Grobów in Polish. Why is it called like this? Basically because a lot of people died. It is calculated around 200,000 people were killed, and that is around 20,000 soldiers, and the rest were civilian victims. So for this reason we call Warsaw a City of Graves, because all those people, well, they had to be buried somewhere. There is an example of a mass grave, a reconstruction of mass grave. 35 spalonych, 35 people burned at Jasna 10th Street. An example, one of the main mass graves that could be found in Warsaw from the time of the Rising.
Unquestionably, Warsaw and Poland suffered tremendous casualties during the Second World War. At the start of the war, for example, Warsaw's population was 1.3 million. At the start of the uprising in 1944, 5 years later, Poland's capital was down to 900,000, predominantly because of extermination policies by Nazi Germany. Just 2 months later, following the end of the uprising on October 2nd, 1944, Warsaw saw its population dwindle to 700,000, and by war's end, it was estimated that only 250,000 people were living in Warsaw. This has been another edition of Borders on Budgets. A reminder, Borders on Budgets. Local people, natural sounds, not a lot of money. From the Warsaw Uprising Museum in Warsaw, Poland, thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Nie tylko chodzi sama tutaj.